Throughout history, conflict seems to have been one of the primary drivers of human creativity and innovation, where in the quest for an advantage over the enemy, armies will develop and test strategies and tactics that often greatly deviate from the norm. This never-ending search for an edge in war has led to the creation of some highly unusual and often outright bizarre units that nevertheless had their own unique roles to play. Here are my choices for 5 of the strangest military units in history. Number 5. The Potsdam Giants. Armies have consistently sought to recruit the biggest, strongest, and most skilled warriors into their ranks in the hopes of obtaining a military advantage over their rivals. However, in the 18th century, King Frederick William I of Prussia turned this desire into a bizarre and all-consuming obsession, spending incredible amounts of his wealth on the construction of a personal regiment of giant soldiers who even today would be considered tall, but during that period of time were considered to be inhumanly massive. Upon taking the Prussian throne in 1713, King Frederick William I set about greatly expanding the size of the Prussian army, more than doubling it from 38,000 men to over 83,000 men by the end of his reign, as well as instituting a host of military reforms that turned the Prussian army into one of the most disciplined, feared, and effective armies in Europe, creating a fighting force that would eventually be used by his son and successor, Frederick the Great, to transform Prussia from a relatively minor German kingdom into a great European power. Yet, while busy building Prussian military power, King Frederick developed an unusual passion for men of great stature, becoming besotted with the idea of building a regiment of soldiers that would contain the tallest men in Europe, collecting the towering individuals like toy soldiers into what became known as the Potsdam Giants. His bizarre obsession summed up by his later confession that the most beautiful girl or woman in the world would be a matter of indifference to me, but tall soldiers, they are my weakness. He quickly set about collecting the rare giants from around his kingdom, and indeed the wider world, dispatching agents to foreign lands to seek out and acquire any child or man of unusual height. Parents were enticed with large payments to hand over their tallest sons, while landowners were greatly compensated for giving up their biggest farmhands, while teachers across the kingdom, keen to please their monarch, kept a watchful eye out for any children under their charge who were expected to grow to unusually great heights. When his own kingdom was emptied of all of its tall men, the king looked to foreign lands, receiving giants as gifts from Austria, Russia, and as far afield as the Ottoman Empire, from kings and emperors, eager to secure friendly relations with the height-crazed Prussian king. Vast fortunes in gold were spent hiring oversized mercenaries and purchasing tall soldiers from other armies, much like a modern football manager transfers players from other teams to his own. Yet even then there were simply not enough tall men to satisfy the king, and so he began looking to more nefarious means to swell the ranks of his Potsdam Giants. In an unusual early experiment in eugenics, tall women were forced to marry his existing giants in an effort to create superhumanly tall offspring. Yet with this method unlikely to bear fruit for several years, the king resorted to press ganging and outright kidnapping men from across Europe. In 1730, the Prussian ambassador to London reportedly participated in the kidnapping of an Irishman named James Kirkland, who was an incredible 7 feet 2 inches tall. Such an unusually tall specimen simply had to be procured into the Prussian king's collection, and so the ambassador enticed the young man with a false job offer as a footman, tricking him into boarding a ship bound for Prussia, where he found himself conscripted against his will into the Potsdam Giants. Another disturbing kidnapping involved a German carpenter who was commissioned to build a large packing crate measuring 6 feet 6 inches, which just so happened to be the same height as the carpenter himself. While such an order should have been a red flag, the unsuspecting carpenter carried out the request, only to be told by the Prussian major who made the order that the crate was too small. According to the story, the carpenter climbed inside the crate to prove that the dimensions were correct, only to find himself hastily sealed inside by 2 of the major's accomplices, the carpenter suffocating to death on the way to the Potsdam Giants barracks due to a lack of air holes in the box. Such cases were thought to have been common, and kidnapped men are believed to have made up a significant portion of the regiment's numbers. The unit grew to a strength of 2 battalions containing as many as 3,200 men, with the only prerequisites for joining being a height requirement of at least 6 feet 2 inches, which even today is well above average, but at that time would have been nothing short of enormous, with many of the men reaching over 7 feet tall to as much as 8 feet. Yet these impressive figures were never sent into battle, the king perhaps afraid to lose any of his precious specimens in combat. The men were instead used as little more than ceremonial figures, consigned to a life of being treated as circus freaks for the king's personal pleasure and entertainment, ordered to march through his bedchambers when the monarch was suffering from one of his frequent illnesses, the bizarre procession led by a tame bear, who was said to have been the regiment's mascot. Kitted out in fine uniforms with caps that were 45 centimeters high to make the men appear even taller, the soldiers were given luxury accommodation and the best food by their royal patron, and were frequently drilled by the king, who delighted in painting their portraits and showing them off to foreign visitors, while the soldiers' pay scale was adjusted based upon height, with the tallest man receiving the highest pay. However, discontent within the ranks was rife. As many of the soldiers had been recruited against their will, and with their lives dominated by the bizarre monarch, many of the giants attempted to desert or even end their own lives, and there were even rumours that the king ordered strange experiments to try and make his possessions even taller, with many of the men forced to endure horrendously painful stretching sessions upon a specially constructed rack. Yet despite investing such considerable resources into the project, it's unlikely that the unit would have been especially effective on the battlefield, with many of the men almost certain to have been medically unfit for combat due to their gigantism. With the king's death in 1740, his son and successor Frederick the Great did not share his father's infatuation with the regiment, which he viewed as a wasteful expense, merging the 3,200 men into other existing units. However, despite the short shelf life of the Potsdam Giants, their creation would cast a long shadow as one of mankind's first experiments with eugenics. Number 4. The Filthy 13. The antics of the unruly group of men of the 1st Demolition Section of the 506th US Parachute Infantry Regiment would be the real-life inspiration for the world-famous book and movie The Dirty Dozen. However, unlike their murderous on-screen counterparts, the men of the Filthy 13 earned their disorderly reputation not because of any serious crimes they had committed, but from their consistent and willful disregard for superior officers and army regulations. Their time off the battlefield spent in frequent drunken brawls, locked up in the brig, or simply absent without leave for days on end. Yet, in a time of such strict military discipline, how did this ragtag group of misfits get away with behaviour that would have landed other soldiers in serious trouble? Under the leadership of Jack McNeice, a man who had enlisted in the army to escape possible criminal charges after nearly killing a man during a drunken brawl in 1942, the men of the 1st Demolition Section became highly trained experts in the arts of sabotage and demolition, tasked with operating behind enemy lines where they would destroy bridges, railways and roads in an effort to wreak havoc amongst enemy forces. However, McNeice soon earned a reputation as a troublemaker. Yet rather than simply locking him up until the end of the war, his superiors decided to put his unique personality to use. Men who arrived at the regiment but were considered to be too ill-disciplined or out of control for other units were sent to McNeice's group, which, despite earning the nickname of Filthy 13, sometimes numbered up to 18 men. This motley collection of soldiers were isolated from the rest of the regiment so that their lack of discipline would not spread to others, and under McNeice's unique leadership, the group soon became notorious for their off-the-battlefield antics. McNeice paid little regard to aspects of military discipline that did not directly affect the mission at hand, and the Filthy 13 found themselves in constant trouble with military authorities. Fistfights with superior officers, drunken brawls, and lengthy periods going absent without leave meant that many of the men were no strangers to the stockade, while on one occasion McNeice intervened when military police were attempting to arrest one of his men, beating the police with their own batons and stealing their guns. Refusing to shower or clean their uniforms, it wasn't long until other soldiers referred to the men as the Filthy 13, however their nickname referred to more than just their personal hygiene. Poaching game from nearby estates, stealing vehicles, officers' whiskey, and anything they wanted that wasn't nailed down, any of the men who happened to earn promotions would find themselves quickly demoted again due to their wild behaviour. Yet despite such a disorderly reputation, the men seem to have gotten away with such questionable behaviour due to their impressive skills in combat, the group of outcasts becoming known as men who were capable of getting difficult jobs done, their rough-and-ready style in ordinary times having no place in the military. Yet during the heat of the Second World War, harnessed as a useful tool for desperate times. The Filthy 13 found themselves handed missions that, although essential to the Allied war effort, were highly dangerous with massive casualty estimates. Being a paratrooper was a dangerous enough job as it was, with the average life expectancy calculated to be just 1.5 jumps, the men usually only given enough food for 1 day, as it was thought that most of them would not be alive long enough to eat it all. However, some of the missions the 13 were assigned had casualty estimates as high as 80%. Perhaps it was because of the sheer danger of the missions the men were being given, coupled with their unique set of skills, that the Filthy 13's unruly antics were tolerated. As notorious troublemakers, McNeice believed that his men were given such dangerous missions as they were viewed as being expendable, yet against the odds he would survive the war, with an incredible 4 combat jumps to his name, far exceeding the life expectancy of the average paratrooper. On the eve of the Normandy invasion in 1944, the men received their orders to land behind German lines and secure or destroy bridges to prevent enemy reinforcements from reaching the vulnerable Allied beachheads. In an effort to psych up his squad and hopefully intimidate his enemy, the men were captured in a famous photograph applying war paint to each other, while sporting unusual mohawks shaved into their heads. Half of the group would be wiped out while successfully accomplishing their mission in Normandy, and the survivors would go on to see action in Operation Market Garden and the Battle of the Bulge, where they participated in a drop that was expected to inflict up to 90% casualties, yet only lost a single man. Number 3. The Night Witches. The Second World War's Eastern Front conjures up images of slaughter and cruelty on an almost unimaginable scale, as desperate German and Soviet soldiers brutally fought each other to the bitter end upon snow-covered battlefields, where all rules of war and even basic humanity itself was completely disregarded. However, a lesser-known theatre of this terrible conflict was taking place in the skies above, as in 1941, with 3 million Soviet soldiers already dead or captured, the German army closing in on Moscow, and the USSR on the verge of total collapse, Stalin resorted to throwing women into the fight, recruiting an unusual female-only regiment of combat pilots, whose incredible exploits would earn the respect of their skeptical male colleagues, while at the same time terrifying their German enemies, who dubbed them the Night Witches. The German invasion of the USSR in 1941 was rapidly advancing deep into the Russian interior, smashing any and all opposition, as their army steamed towards Moscow itself, and like the earlier blitzkrieg campaigns in the West that had made short work of the mighty France, it must have seemed that the Soviet Union would soon capitulate and be added to the long list of the German army's incredible victories. With German forces just 19 miles from Moscow, Leningrad under siege, and with 3 million Soviet soldiers dead or captured in the first 6 months of the invasion, Stalin needed every able-bodied citizen to join the fight to prevent the complete collapse of the country, and so against all norms and traditions of the time, ordered Marina Roskova, a record-breaking female aviator, to use her celebrity, prestige, and skills as a pilot to organize a regiment of women-only pilots to carry out nighttime combat bombing missions designed to harass and slow down the rapidly advancing enemy. Although women had initially been barred from combat, Stalin ordered the creation and deployment of 3 Women's Air Force units, including the 588th Regiment, which was composed entirely of women, and over the course of the war would ultimately mobilize over 800,000 females, many of them serving in combat roles as tank crew, machine gunners, snipers, and medics. Yet while such a policy might seem incredibly progressive in the modern era, let alone in the 1940s, this decision was motivated by desperation at the pressure exerted by the almost unstoppable advance of the enemy, rather than any forward-thinking desire for gender equality. The regiment received over 2,000 applications from women keen to defend the motherland, from which Marina Roskova selected 400 recruits, most of whom were little more than girls aged between just 17 and 26. Tasked with flying nighttime harassment and precision bombing missions against German forces, the regiment had to make do with meagre resources, including old male uniforms and out-of-date biplanes, which had originally been designed for use as training aircraft and crop dusters. These old planes would later be described by the pilots as being like a coffin with wings, their light frames only able to carry 2 bombs at a time, requiring the 2-woman crew to carry out between 8 and 18 risky missions per night for their limited armaments to inflict any real damage on the enemy. The slow and obsolete aircraft were no match for advanced German fighters, and so the Night Witches had to make use of their weakness in order to stand any chance of surviving. Realizing that as their maximum flight speed was lower than the stall speed of German fighter craft, German pilots found them very difficult to shoot down as their own planes were travelling so much faster, causing them to speed past the Witches before they could get more than a few shots off. Their attack strategy evolved into idling the engines of their plywood aircraft as they approached their target under cover of darkness, so that they could execute their mission under almost complete stealth, virtually appearing out of nowhere to drop their bombs on the Germans below, their enemies giving them their famous nickname of the Night Witches, as the planes seemed to operate in complete silence other than the wind noise generated by their gliding aircraft, which the Germans compared to the sound of a witch's broomstick. Enemy forces were convinced that the Night Witches were all criminals who had been sent to the front lines as punishment for their deeds, while others speculated that the women had been given special injections that allowed them to see in the night, and their reputation was so feared that any German soldier who shot down one of their planes would automatically be awarded the Iron Cross. Flying at night in temperatures that were often below freezing, the bitter wind and cold inflicted frequent frostbites, while accidentally touching an exterior surface of the plane could rip off bare skin. The plywood planes were especially susceptible to tracer bullets, which could easily engulf the entire aircraft in flames should just one round find its target, while the weight of the bombs and low altitude of flight meant that no parachutes were supplied on board, making surviving a crash unlikely. Growing to 40 two-person crews, the regiment would eventually fly an incredible 23,000 missions, during which 3,000 tons of bombs were dropped on the enemy, with many pilots personally flying over 800 missions, with 23 women awarded the Hero of the Soviet Union title, with 32 dying by the end of the conflict. Yet despite being so highly decorated, the sacrifice of the Night Witches would be snubbed during the Victory Day parade in Moscow, supposedly because the planes they flew were too slow. Number 2. The Sacred Band of Thebes. In the 4th century BC, a small force of 300 heavy infantry would dominate battlefields across Greece for over 50 years, even inflicting crushing defeats upon the legendary Spartans, the elite unit of men widely celebrated for their courage and skill in combat. Their stunning victories over many powerful enemies, paving the way for the city-state of Thebes to become a dominant power in Greece. However, what makes the Sacred Band so unique is that the unit entirely consisted of 150 pairs of male lovers who lived, trained, and fought together when even thousands of years later, the issue of same-gender relationships in the military is still a hotly debated and controversial topic. Initially formed to protect the city stronghold from outside invaders, the men were hand-picked not based upon their birth or social class, but solely upon their ability and merit, and comprised of 150 couples, where one partner was typically an older male known as the lover, while the other was a younger man known as the beloved. The idea of a military unit formed of lovers seems to have been based upon the notion that on the front lines, such an army would prove more effective in the heat of battle than an ordinary force, since each man would have at his side not only a friend and brother in arms, but also somebody that they had a deep bond with, spurring them on to unrivaled heights of bravery. Rather than risk allowing their watching lover to glimpse cowardice, the men rushing into danger and harm's way to aid each other as they fought to keep their partners alive. Young men forming relationships with older and more experienced tutors was nothing new, the older man taking the younger under his wing and initiating an exchange of ideas, knowledge, and skills that operated as something like an early form of apprenticeship, where powerful friendships could be formed and unbreakable bonds built between promising youths and their more established mentors. It was thought that extending this practice to the military would result in a unit with unrivaled morale in the face of danger, and the accomplishments of the Sacred Band would go on to prove this theory to be correct. A young man around 20 years old would be chosen by a mentor in his early 30s, the two bound by ceremonial vows. Their new relationship symbolized with the tutor gifting his protege with a set of armor. Training for the sacred band consisted of wrestling, dancing, and horse riding, the men spending virtually all of their time with each other so as to foster deep bonds and perhaps even love. Should one of the pairs fall in battle or grow too old for service, new partners would be brought in to keep up the unit's numbers. Taking on the role of shock troops, their main function was to kill the enemy's best men and leaders in battle as quickly as possible, shattering enemy morale, wreaking chaos in their lines, and greatly increasing the likelihood of a complete rout, even though the sacred band frequently fought in battles where they were greatly outnumbered. The unit fought with distinction in several pivotal battles, twice enabling incredible victories over the Spartans, who had once been thought invincible. At the Battle of Tegea, the overconfident Spartans were humbled by the sacred band, despite having far greater numbers, while at the Battle of Leuctra, the sacred band held the main Spartan force in place, while the rest of the Theban army flanked them, resulting in over 1,000 dead Spartans, including their king, a defeat that has since been described as the most decisive battle ever fought by Greeks against Greeks, and one that resulted in Thebes replacing Sparta as the dominant power in Greece. Yet the sacred band's incredible achievements would prove short-lived, with a new power on the rise in the form of the Macedonians under Philip II and his son Alexander. An alliance of Greek city-states led by Athens and Thebes were soundly beaten by the invading Macedonians, unable to deal with their new long-speared phalanx, the hoplites used so widely across Greece, now showing their age. The Greeks broke and fled in panic. However, the sacred band of Thebes refused to retreat, despite being surrounded and massively outnumbered, standing their ground until they were cut down to the last man, the entire unit utterly annihilated in a single day. The grit and bravery they displayed supposedly even moving Philip of Macedon to tears when he caught sight of their corpses lying together on the battlefield. Number 1. The Ghost Army. You might think that one of the main requirements of an effective military unit is to engage and destroy the enemy in combat. However, during the Second World War, the US Ghost Army would inflict serious defeats on its foes without firing a single shot. The 1,100 men and women who formed this remarkable unit, possessing no combat training, instead being an unusual mix of actors, artists, designers, and engineers, who used detailed and elaborate illusions to confuse, mislead, and deceive the enemy at a pivotal stage of the conflict, with an arsenal of unlikely weapons that included inflatable tanks, rubber airplanes, costumes, and sound trucks, directly contributing to the Allied victory in what became perhaps the greatest deception in history. The inspiration for the Ghost Army was Operation Bertram, a daring British plan that used dummy tanks, fake military installations, and false radio transmissions to trick the German army in North Africa into thinking that the upcoming British attack would take place much further south than was actually planned, forcing the Germans to divert vast amounts of military assets away from the main front lines, and proving that such a deception could change the course of a battle and even the war itself. Officially known as the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, the Ghost Army was formed with the goal of tipping the balance in the Allies' favour by deceiving the enemy rather than destroying them, misleading German intelligence with an array of elaborate illusions and misinformation campaigns designed to confuse the Germans about Allied army strength, position, and intent. 1,100 talented individuals were recruited not from the military, but from art schools, advertisement agencies, universities, and movie sets across the United States. The unusual group tasked with using their creativity and innovation to build a phantom army that would shroud the enemy in an unbreakable fog of war. The unit's talents were put to use in 20 separate missions where the intricately crafted illusions fooled the enemy about where Allied troops were stationed, what their numbers were, and where they intended to attack. The deceptions were split into 4 groups. The visual element utilized inflatable tanks, artillery vehicles, and aircraft that would be pumped full of air and given basic camouflage so that enemy air reconnaissance could see them on the ground, masking the true size and position of Allied forces. Dummy airfields with fake laundry hanging outside to make them appear real made the Allied air threat seem far more dangerous than it actually was, while fake tank formations and motorpools made the Germans believe that massive military forces were stationed in areas that were in fact lightly defended. The sonic element used advanced sound recordings of real infantry units and vehicles, playing them back through powerful amplifiers and speakers that could be heard as far as 15 miles away, again fooling the enemy into believing that Allied forces were present in the wrong area. The radio element created phony broadcasts, impersonating radio operators from real units to misdirect the listening Germans. While last but not least, the atmosphere element used actors to spread misinformation that they hoped would be picked up by enemy spies, as well as posing as members of other divisions and even generals, while troop transports loaded with just a single driver and 2 soldiers in the rear would drive around, giving a false impression of large-scale troop movements. On multiple occasions, the Ghost Army turned the tide of battle in favour of the Allies, impersonating 2 divisions some 40,000 strong to lure German forces away from the US 9th Army, allowing it to cross the Rhine River safely, even going so far as to cover up a 70-mile gap in General Patton's line at Metz by pretending to be a much larger force of 20,000 men, thus preventing the Germans from exploiting the gap and possibly dooming the entire operation. The 20 missions carried out by the Ghost Army are estimated to have saved anywhere from 15,000 to as many as 30,000 Allied lives, while being an instrumental force in some of the Western Front's greatest victories, all without engaging in direct battle and possessing no combat training. So those are my choices for 5 of the most unusual military units in history. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and I'll see you again soon.